Now then, Mr. Anik, welcome to talkSPORT, and I don't know if welcome to boxing is the right thing, because you've been across all different types of sports throughout the course of your career, but when we talk boxing, probably none more bigger than what we're about to experience come Saturday night.
It's great to see you. It's great to see you in your world. I'll take the welcome to boxing, to be sure. You know, the last fight that I was charged with calling on ESPN was the WBC Heavyweight Championship between Vitaly Klitschko and Shannon Briggs. And back then, I get the assignment. I think I'm going to Germany. And they're like, bro, you're just going to call it from a control room here in Bristol, Connecticut. You know, so it's been a minute. And as you know, my Saturday nights have been devoted to the UFC for the better part of the last 15 years. But Mandalay Bay used to have a slogan when, boxing at its best. And I always would lean into that because as a UFC guy and a mixed martial arts guy, when boxing is at its best, oftentimes I would say nothing touches it, but how often is boxing at its best? And certainly no main event is bulletproof, but this is boxing at its best. I think these guys are closer to their fighting primes than some talking heads would suggest, and can't wait to have a hot microphone Saturday night, my brother.
Well, let's look into what you just said there regarding where boxing is currently at in the landscape of American sports. Are the audience engaged with it? Is this one cutting through? And how has it been over the last 5 to 10 years with audience involvement and engagement with the sport of boxing?
I think there's a lot of room for growth, and I think that probably as a thesis statement goes without saying. You know, I think when I covered boxing, there was a time when Winky Wright Bernard Hopkins, maybe in 2007, was the 5th or 6th biggest event of that year. And yet boxing was the centerpiece of the sports world 6 times a year when I was covering the sport. 03, 04, 05 wasn't necessarily boxing's heyday, but was a really relevant time when Oscar De La Hoya fought Floyd Mayweather. That was the same year of Winky and Bernard. So how do we get back to that? And I think it's making people care about Lester Martinez and Christian and Billy. And that's the gap that we're really trying to close. But in terms of overall combat sports resonation, this feels like the biggest live event that I've ever been assigned, maybe next to Khabib Nurmagomedov versus Conor McGregor. And I covered a lot of those big HBO boxing pay-per-views back in the day, and this feels enormous to me. So I'm glad Bud Crawford's getting his shine. I think, in a long-winded way, Adam, I would say if he had a knockout streak like this in the UFC, he'd be a massive star in the US.
I agree. What has been the problem, do you think? Do you think it is because, you just mentioned HBO there, they're no longer involved in the sport. ESPN have just lost their top-ranked scenario. Is it because they're not on what you would class as normal television platforms? Or is it deeper than that? Is it down to matchmaking? Is it down to the lack of stars? What is it down to that the American audience have kind of disengaged a little bit with it?
Well, I think it's not as ingestible in a lot of respects, and sometimes you could pare it down to even just how many divisions there are, but right, is it super welterweight or junior middleweight? Even that is confusing, right? There are a lot of different things, I think, that don't make boxing as ingestible. Now there are a lot of different promotions in the combat sports world that are trying to find the perfect rule set, right, to make it as watchable as possible. Right? My twin brother over there works for Dirty Boxing, right? They went to great lengths to try to find a rule set that would be bulletproof, right? That wouldn't have a stinker in a major spot. And I don't have to tell you what happened in Chicago, Illinois, even though you and I enjoyed Khamzat Chimaev versus Dricus du Plessis. As the play-by-play announcer, I billed it as the most chaotic matchup we could put together, and it was anything but that, So I think for boxing, it's really about humanizing athletes and helping to build stars. And that's when I sign a contract on the dotted line, and you know this in your world, like that's what we're trying to do, right? Like, and maybe nobody's better in a one-on-one setting at doing that than you, humanizing guys and, making people care, right? And what humanizes guys, when their back's up against the proverbial wall, when they're coming off a loss, but Lester Martinez from Guatemala could be a massive star. He's the biggest boxing star out of his nation, like ever, and he starts talking about his father, and he immediately is brought to tears. How do I make, or at least help make, Lester Martinez a star on Saturday night? That's my charge.
Well, let's go then, man. How do you approach this differently than what you're used to doing on a Saturday night with the UFC, or is the whole point of this to try and add a whole new flavour to boxing broadcasting?
I'm going to do my thing. I don't go in there with any sort of agenda. I haven't even thought about what I would say if Canelo Alvarez or Terrence Bud Crawford produces a knockout. You know what I mean? I am going to stay in my lane, as oftentimes I do. I'm going to try to elevate the live event with energy and context and relevant information and find my spots in what is inherently a chaotic atmosphere. But just excited to try to elevate this live event as best I can. In terms of my preparation, certainly it's been condensed, right, in terms of trying to prep maybe a decade's worth of stuff into 3 or 4 weeks, and even when it comes to just studying the referee or the judges involved. You know, there's just been a lot to it.
Also, as well as that, we're used to in MMA talking about unified rules and the criteria of how we go about scoring fights. It's very different in the world of boxing because it's all up in the air a little bit, and therefore you get a lot, especially in British commentary, of it's what you like type of scenario. That's going to be quite difficult as well to kind of manage the fight from a scoring point of view, because there isn't that unified scoring criteria to keep everybody on track.
Absolutely, and even the most elite judging minds in the boxing world oftentimes disagree, right? I mean, truly, I feel like in boxing, more than mixed martial arts, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Even if you look at Canelo Alvarez's performance against Edgar Berlanga, and I'm not necessarily the guy who has the historical framework, but why are people denigrating that performance? Like, that left hook could have absolutely felled Berlanga, and had he knocked him out instead of knocked him down, I think the whole preamble and narrative on Canelo Alvarez coming in here is not that some of his last performances have been listless or that, you know, Berlanga got knocked out in the fight thereafter. It would be that Canelo Alvarez's hands look just as fast as before, you know? So it's been fascinating for me to sort of peel back the curtain and listen to certain talking heads, you know? But if Max Kellerman and Andre Ward tell you that this is not a prime Canelo Alvarez, I'd be inclined to believe them. But I'm really excited to see what these two athletes deliver on this stage.
Now, it's always difficult for me to put you on the spot when you're calling a fight, so I'm
Yeah.
not going to do that, but just from a fan point of view, stylistically, watching the likes of Canelo, watching the likes of Crawford, everybody at home is obviously extremely excited about the matchup itself. What have you made of that? When that came together, when they announced Canelo Crawford, what did you make of the actual matchup that they put together?
Well, I think it's fascinating. I think, as Max Kellerman has said, we're going to find out early on. He thinks within 30 seconds how much the weight is actually going to matter. You know, I think you and I are probably in our lifetimes have been around 154 pounds and 168 pounds maybe at times, you know. So I know for me, you know, when I'm fat, I'm 168, and when I'm in shape, I'm 154. So, you know, I think maybe too much has been made of that, or maybe too little, right, in terms of Canelo's bone density, how many big men he's actually fought. But yeah, I mean, that's been a jumping off point for the analysis. I guess for me, you know, if any fighter could take the air out of the fight and make it not entertaining, I suppose it would be Canelo Alvarez, but I just don't think that that is his nature. And there were so many extenuating circumstances in that Williams School fight, Saudi Arabia, 6 o'clock in the morning, School completely taking the air out of that fight. I think it's going to be fantastic. You know, I'm not supposed to get predictive, but I think we're getting a knockout. And a lot of people think I'm crazy.
Love that. I love that. Just finally, you've called many historic moments with the UFC, big firsts, man, it's all this stuff that has happened in the UFC over the last 10 years. This, at the weekend, feels like a moment of history. From a Canelo point of view, of course, it's a Mexican holiday weekend. He's defending his crown in front of his people, all those types of things. But from a Terence Crawford point of view, if he can pull this off and become a three-weight, undisputed champion, first one in the four-belt era, I think we've got to go all the way back to 1937 and Henry Armstrong when he did it. We stand on the edge of a real historic moment if he can pull this off come Saturday.
You know, I'm going through a great book, The 100 Greatest Boxers of All Time, and it's such a hard group to crack. I mean, you should see all the names that are on the cutting room floor, and depending on which pundit you talk to, you know, Terence Bud Crawford this weekend could be fighting for top 15 status all time, or even Mount Rushmore status this weekend, right? And it's hard to compare eras, to be sure, and a lot of all-time greats, Salvador Sanchez, had their primes cut short, right? But I think he is fighting for true all-time greatness this weekend, and he doesn't even need style points, right? You sort of set up the credentials and some of the things that he's actually fighting for. You know, I have said publicly that Canelo Alvarez, as the naturally bigger man, maybe has more to lose, but appreciable things to gain for him legacy-wise as well. If Bud Crawford can pull this off, you know, without ever fighting at middleweight at 160 pounds against the face of boxing, one night, you get one night. You know, Floyd Mayweather, say what you want about slow starts against Sugar Shane Mosley. Never flat on fight night in totality for Floyd, 50-0. You get one chance to do this. And if Bud can do this, you know, I don't know how you deny him top 10 all-time status, you know, even from a mixed martial arts guy.
And on that note, we'll leave it there. My man, go
Thank
well.
you, brother.
I can't wait
Thank
to
you so
hear
much.
you call this
You're
fight.
the man.
You
Thank
are,
you,
no,
brother.
you're the man.
Thank you,
Make sure
man.
you tune in Saturday night, live on Netflix. This is The Voice that'll be calling you through that historic fight.